Well, hello everybody. Steve the Amateur Historian coming to you from the vicinity of Grand and Irving. And it's right down the street from the convention center. Keep having murder cases that keep bringing me closer and closer back towards the convention center. And as you can clearly see, this is all commercial space these days. But back in the good old days, way back in the good old days, this was mostly residential. And, with some commercial warehousing, port, whatnot, down right by the river. But this was, just try to envision it. This all being just houses and apartment houses and what have you. And in 1899, a young woman, a teenage girl named Clara Fitch, lived at this intersection. And that is the setting for a fresh episode of Historic Murders of Portland. Thank you for being really loud in the middle of my intro. So for our sake, it is July 19th, 1899, just a couple months before turn of the century. And Clara Fitch was again living at this intersection with her family. And reportedly, I think it was like late afternoon, early evening, Clara told her parents that she was going to go over to a friend's house of hers. She left the house, and later on in the evening when she didn't come home, because people were a lot more, chill, parents would send their 4 or 5-year-old kids to the store several blocks away on their own because they thought it was safe. And when Clara didn't return home here later that night, her parents just assumed without a second thought, it seems, that she just decided to spend the night at her friend's house. And that was all fine and good until the following day. Just a couple blocks from where Clara Fitch lived, we're in the Lloyd district. That's what it is now. I'm walking through Holiday Park, which is attractive, has its good parts. I wish I could say the same for number of people that hang out in this park. There's a lot of sketchy people, unfortunately a lot of mentally ill, drug addicted. There's just enough gun violence in the area to kind of keep me nervous, but today this is essentially regarded as the Lloyd district. But and here's the Lloyd Center Mall, which I believe is Oregon's oldest mall. And like so many other parts of Portland, this is what it looks like now, but in 1899 this was a lot more open, likely very residential. And right across the street here is the Lloyd Cinema, and right on the other side of that was a massive, several square blocks by square blocks, park called Cycle Park. So of course, with it being over 120 years later, things are, as usual, much different looking than they were then. This area right here, right behind me, would have been the southwest corner of Cycle Park. All of this would have just been open park space that you would have seen beyond me. So coming up to 19th in Multnomah. Actually, I'd be in the park right now, because the park pretty much went this way, another block or two towards Sullivan's. This is the Sullivan's Gulch neighborhood, but the actual gulch itself, which is right over here. And it went all the way up to Halsey, which is a couple blocks that way. And again, this is 19th. The park went from 18th Avenue, one block back here, all the way up to 24th. And even these houses, you can tell these are really old houses right here. These were probably built right after the park. And I don't really know the circumstances I don't really know the history of Cycle Park. But this all would have just been this big, massive park. I mean, it was like 6 blocks by 6. It was, so, it was like, 36, 40 square blocks. It was a big park. And I certainly can't say with any certainty what part of the park this occurred in. All I know is we're walking right in the middle of what would have been Cycle Park back in 1899, which I think the title mainly was, the park was made with lots of probably paths for people to ride their bicycles on. Bicycling was becoming a fairly, it'd been around for a long time, but it was becoming a more and more popular thing, kind of like what jogging became in the 70s. And so they made this massive park. At least I'm assuming that's the case in terms of why it was established, why it was called Cycle Park. But again, Clara Fitch leaves her home on July 19th, doesn't return home. Her parents assume she's staying the night at a friend's house. And during the 4 o'clock hour, p.m., a man stumbles on to a woman in Cycle Park. Would have been, right in this area. And he assumed it was a woman that was maybe drunk, probably passed out. There was just a little bit of her body sticking out from under some brush. And, so again, I believe authorities were called. The initial presumption was this is a local drunk who passed out, fell into the bushes, and now we gotta, bring him around. But then when they, revealed the whole body, they discovered the body of a young woman who had perceivably been strangled. She had like a velvet cloth wrapped tight around her neck. And it was definitely, a very violent murder, and a murder in which it seemed the young woman had been overpowered. And they noticed when they found her body, she obviously had been wearing a hat, and she was face down when she was discovered, and her face was just resting into the hat. And they're thinking whoever killed her shoved her head into the hat to smother like any screams she would have made. So it was a very brutal crime scene. And unfortunately, after she was found and taken from the site, she was identified very quickly as Clara Fitch. So, understandably, with Clara Fitch's body suddenly being discovered in Cycle Park, one of the first things authorities did was they went and saw her friend that she was claimed that she was going to go visit. That was the ruse that she was using to go see good old Frank McDaniel. Her friend was named Bertha Sutherland, and then when they spoke to her, and all Bertha could really tell them was when she last saw Clara, she was walking around with a guy named Frank McDaniel, which I realized I just said Frank McDaniel passively a second ago. Anyway, whatever way you shake it up, she was seen in the presence of a man named Frank McDaniel. So now the police have a lead. And so as the authorities go searching for this Frank McDaniel, who we have an eyewitness saying was with Clara Fitch the nights before she's found dead, the authorities ultimately track him. I think they found him, he was like just on the west side of the river, kind of near where the Morrison Bridge is today on the west side. And he's apprehended there. And I believe when he was caught, because of course, one of the first things they're going to do is ask him, hey, do you know Clara Fitch? And, oh, did you know that she's been found murdered in Cycle Park? And he, I know when he was apprehended, he said he knew that she had been murdered, but he learned about it through some work friends of his. It was, it was the day after the murder had happened, and he claimed that he was with some friends, and one of them passively said, like, oh man, did you hear about what they found over in Cycle Park? And Frank McDaniel, it seems like he kind of put the pieces together in his own mind that, oh, that was probably Clara. Or I think he asked one of his friends, like, did they know the name of the person? And that was how he found out. And it's interesting because he was seeing her, like they were seeing each other. It seemed like they actually had feelings for one another, or were at least faking like they were, or trying to blindly convince themselves that they had feelings for one another. But it's just interesting that when he was apprehended, it seems like he wasn't really all that bothered by the discovery. And it seems like, based on the way the newspapers reported it, he just had a very matter-of-fact experience when he was apprehended, and the authorities wanted to know, what happened with you and Clara on the night of July 19th. So when the police get their hands on McDaniel, who is at this time the only suspect they really have to even look into right now, he was fairly forward, it seems. He admitted that he had seen Clara Fitch the night of July 19th. Said they went out together, and spent time in Cycle Park together, which from this intersection where Clara Fitch lived, Cycle Park is several blocks off this, like directly this way. And yeah, he admitted they went there together. They stayed there till about 10 p.m. And he said that they walked around a little while longer, and he dropped her off approximately 2 blocks away from her house, which would have been right here. So he would have dropped her off, 2 blocks this way is what it seems. So it's a little ways down there. And his reasoning for this is that, he claimed that Clara Fitch's family didn't care much for him. They didn't want her seeing him, refused to allow it. I think he might have been a little bit older than her. I don't know how much they knew about him. It didn't seem like he had that bad of a reputation. But for whatever reason, her family just wouldn't accept it. So they were seeing each other under clandestine means, which actually sounds like the truth. And, it's interesting that if a guy is, guilty of murdering someone whose body is found in Cycle Park, and then he openly admits to seeing her secretively and admitting that they spend time at Cycle Park, and then saying he dropped her off right down here, and they were actually seen together right down there. It's very interesting, You have a guy who admits being with the victim right before she was killed, but he's admitting to details that it seems like a real murderer who's trying to stay under the radar wouldn't admit to. And we have witnesses who claim to have seen them together right down here where he supposedly left her off. So it's very strange that, the strangest aspect of the case is the fact that, they go to Cycle Park where Clara's body is found. But then later on, they're seen over here, which we're several blocks. We're, at least 13, 14 blocks away from where Cycle Park is right now. So the idea would have to be that they leave Cycle Park, they come back towards where Clara lived over here, and then somehow end up back at the park way over there. This is, of course, if McDaniel is the guilty killer. And as I'm approaching, this would actually be the east end of the park, would be like right over here, the next block down. And again, it would have gone several more blocks this way, so this would have all been park space. These multiple blocks I've traversed, a very pretty neighborhood and a lot of older houses, so you can kind of get the vibe that not too long after this case, the park was probably scrapped. And this is really cute that I'm walking through. I mean, here I am talking murder, and I'm looking at all the beautiful things that are to be seen, but this is Sullivan Gulch neighborhood. I've never really walked through here. It's really pretty. But in this case of something not so pretty, the murder of a teenage girl, it was a very complex situation going to trial, because there was, granted, Frank McDaniel's the last person seen with Clara Fitch. They were seeing each other. All sorts of theories can come about. Did she maybe tell him that, the complications with her parents, it was too much, she couldn't see him anymore? Had she maybe taken an interest in another man, and that sent him into a rage and he killed her? I mean, there's any number of theories you can bring about, but is there any substance to them? And, it is still strange that Frank McDaniel openly admitted to seeing Clara Fitch that night, admitted to being in Cycle Park with her only a short while before she was killed. But then, he admits later on that he dropped her off a couple blocks from her house so her parents wouldn't see them together. And they were seen. They weren't only seen in the vicinity of the area where he dropped her off, which technically vindicates to a degree that part of his story, but there was a couple of kids that saw them leaving Cycle Park together around 10:10 p.m. And even Frank McDaniel said it was around 10 when they left. So it's just, this guy, admits to so much, and pretty much all aspects of his story that can, beyond any doubt, be proven to be true were vindicated. Primarily through other eyewitnesses. So, there's reasons to see his guilt, but to me, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of reasonable doubt. It is definitely strange that he would drop her off. It's the classic, someone who kills someone. They always say, it's always like, why didn't you take him to the door? Now, granted, this guy apparently had a legitimate reason to not take her to her door, but it's always, I left them, a block from their house, and because then it leaves room for, someone must have grabbed him between here and there, but it wasn't me. Because obviously, if you say you walked somebody home, and then they suddenly disappear before getting home, well, then we know it's you. I feel like there was definitely a lot of reasonable doubt in this case, but when Frank McDaniel went on trial, he was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter. The jury essentially felt that he had committed this killing, but they also didn't feel that he was capable of premeditated murder. So they felt that this wasn't pre-planned, that when this night began and they got together, he wasn't planning on ultimately killing her. So he was found guilty of manslaughter, and they requested the stiffest sentence you could get for that, probably because of the the brutality of the murder. I think they were thinking he snapped and just killed her. Was ultimately what they... But I couldn't really find any details, like in-depth details about what was the... what was... we... Again, with all this conflict, what was the motivation? How did the prosecution... What was their story? How did they convince the jury to find this guy guilty? And he was given a 15-year sentence, and I think had a $500 fine added on to that. And he ultimately... I think he tried to appeal the case numerous times, because again, objectively, there was reasonable doubt in this case as to whether he was legitimately the murderer. They had no... I don't think they had any evidence, like at the scene of the crime, to show that he had done it for any certainty. But all of his appeals were rejected. There's probably a lot of pressure. This was the murder of a young woman. And in cases like that, society always wants someone to take the fall, whether they did it or not. So, if you get convicted of a murder of this sort, whether you did it or not, it's hard for you to get out. And that is a tragic reality of the way society functions. We don't want to know the details. We just want to make sure in this case that somebody's paying the price, and then we can sleep well at night, even if the real killer's still out there doing it. It's ridiculous, but it's the way society has always functioned, it seems, in one way or another. And I want to say I found an article, and I wasn't able to find it again, but I believe that Frank McDaniel wasn't that old when he was convicted, and I think only a couple of years after he ended up in jail, or prison, he died in prison of some ailment. I think like in 1903 or something like that. So he was really young when he died. Don't hold me to that, because I haven't been able to find the article again. But yeah, I'm pretty sure Frank McDaniel died only a couple years after going to prison. So he would have only been in I think probably his early to mid-20s. And that said, getting back to the point I was starting to get into, which was, how did they decide, how did the prosecution convince a jury? What was their story? Because nobody really knows the circumstances of how Clara Fitch died beyond the story of Frank McDaniel saying that he left her, a couple blocks from her house and then went home. Well, obviously, and again, with that detail being bore out, what happened? He obviously would have had to have chased her down, stopped her, somehow ended up taking her back towards Cycle Park, or, if you believe another theory, that somebody else did the crime. And, somebody else grabbed her. And coincidentally, ended up killing her in the same place that she was at Frank McDaniel with earlier that night. And so I couldn't find it. They wouldn't give any details. It was just, this is Frank McDaniel pleads not guilty. Frank McDaniel's gonna, the jury's gonna come back with a conviction today. Jury comes back with a manslaughter thing, 15 years. I just could find, all I could find was the base details, and then I found one newspaper article that I think was from later on when he was trying to get one of his appeals. And they actually laid out the groundwork. They laid out the prosecution's case for what they claim was the circumstances regarding Frank McDaniel as the guilty party murdering Clara Fitch in Cycle Park after he claims to have supposedly dropped her off on her way from home. This is one of the most crazy theories I've ever heard. It's deeply disturbing, whether it's true or not, but this was literally the story that the prosecution put forward in their case to claim that Frank McDaniel killed Clara Fitch. Now, this account that the prosecution gave, it is deep, it is crazy, it is really dark. Even as I was taking the notes, I was just like, this is bizarre, and I don't know if they had any evidence to back it up. So essentially what the prosecution argued at trial against Frank McDaniel, this is what was used to convince the jury of his guilt, was that Frank McDaniel had apparently impregnated Clara Fitch, who again was still a teenager, And I think McDaniel was a young adult, so he was a little bit older than her. And I don't necessarily think he was worried so much about the age difference. 20 and 30-year-olds marrying teenagers was unfortunately, a fairly common thing, unfortunately. But I think what he was most concerned about was the ramifications he would face, either from Clara Fitch's family. I think he was probably genuinely pretty scared of them. And I think he was scared what would happen if they found out that he had impregnated their daughter. What lengths would they go to, ruin his life? So the prosecution's story is that Frank McDaniel had impregnated Clara Fitch. He's scared out of his mind of what will happen if this is found out. And he manages to obtain some medical instruments from a friend he has who is maybe going to medical school or just has access to medical instruments. And he coaxes Clara to Cycle Park. And while they're there, this is the first time they're there, before they leave a little after 10 p.m. And apparently McDaniel uses these instruments to perform an abortion on Clara Fitch right there in the park. That is literally what they claim happened. And they say that, it's incredibly painful and it's incredibly emotional, and Clara Fitch starts just getting she kind of starts getting just emotionally erratic. I can't even imagine this just, he takes her to this park, hides behind some bushes, and then performs presumably an abortion on her. I'm guessing 1899, this wasn't legal at all. But he wanted to, I think, cover things up, and his plan was he would walk around with Clara for a little while, hang out with her till she, managed to calm down from this experience, it seems, and then he would ultimately let her go home. And so they're walking around together, and that's when they're seen in the vicinity, a couple blocks south of her home. And what the prosecution claims is that even after several hours, Clara is not calming down, and she's still just an erratic, emotional wreck. And he gets scared. He's worried that, we can't take her home. She's not chilling out. And he's probably scared to death that, it's one thing for her to ultimately spill the beans and tell her parents, hey, Frank McDaniel knocked me up. It's another thing altogether to say, hey, Frank McDaniel knocked me up and he just took me to Cycle Park and performed an abortion on me. Especially back in the gun-toting days of early Portland, men killed for much less. And I think if Clara Fitch's dad found out that bit of information, I think he would have been walking the streets looking for Frank McDaniel, and probably wouldn't have stopped till he got him. So I think Frank McDaniel's panic goes up several levels, and he decides he has to kill her. So he lures her back to Cycle Park, and, again, stays with her, it seems, maybe a little bit longer, hoping she'll calm down. She's not going to do it, and finally he decides to take her to a secluded spot and kill her by stuffing her face into the hat she wore and, suffocating her to death. That's the prosecution story about why Frank McDaniel killed Clara Fitch. And again, I don't know if they have any evidence or had any evidence to prove this story. But as far as I can tell from all the information I read before, there's no evidence to defend this story that the prosecution told. But again, when a young woman is killed like this, you want someone to pay for it. So, again, it seems the jury felt Frank McDaniel was guilty. Maybe the reason they didn't find him guilty of first-degree murder was they thought he did it because he was seen with her, but they honestly didn't believe the prosecution's story. It's one of the most absurd stories I've ever seen. I think it's nonsense. I think it's a farce. Obviously, I can't prove it one way or another. But, you know, like, what a convenience. Pick something that is, you know, abortion is polarizing today. Imagine what it was like back then, especially with so many people being more against it. I think they thought they could play that card, and that would just completely juke the jury to their side. I don't know if it worked, though, since Frank McDaniel was only found guilty of manslaughter, and they felt that he wasn't capable of premeditated murder, again, is what the newspapers say. But apparently he was capable of committing a abortion on his girlfriend with no medical background, as far as I can gather. Just such a cringy, disturbing story. And, you know, as much as I don't think it happened, I hope it didn't happen. It's sad enough that Clara Fitch had to die the way she did, and so young. You don't want to think she had to experience further pain and torment beyond that in the final hours of her existence. So a very, very dark story, no matter which way you shake it. But that prosecution account kicked it up several notches. I was blown away by that being their primary motive to claim that Frank McDaniel was guilty. Way back in 1899. That is the story of the murder of Clara Fitch, at least as far as we know. Was Frank McDaniel guilty? I'm so on the fence about this one. He was the last person seen with her, but again, pretty much everything he told was proven to be true. We don't have any verification why he would have wanted to kill her. It seemed like they were getting by, you know, meeting, rendezvousing in a clandestine manner. There's not really any valid, unless you believe the prosecution, it's not really any reason to believe that he would just freak and kill this girl that he supposedly was in love with. Which is probably why the prosecution had to come up with such a crazy story. I don't know. It boggles the mind. I really don't know if he did it. But he was the one that paid the price for it, ultimately. And that is the story, with a very bleak and troubling conclusion. So as always, guys, remember to like, share, subscribe. You don't necessarily have to like the things I'm having to talk about in certain circumstances. And remember to hit my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. And all that said, till next time, from it's actually Oregon Park, it's just a tiny little park, just the other side of Sullivan Gulch. So Cycle Park would have been just off this way. So from Oregon Park, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland. Catch you next time.